the blood came out of his ears, such was the beating that he received.
If you think his grandmother was taken away by the other tribes,
he would have been absolutely astonished to discover what he did achieve in his adult later life.
sometimes when you're looking for something, it's not always what you think you're going to find.
Marion Walls lives in Glasgow. She's from a small, close-knit family, a mother and grandmother. But there's a part of that family's history that's always been shrouded in mystery. An exotic surname from generations past.
When my mother passed away in 2002, I unfortunately developed multiple allergies and was unable to leave the house. My mother and I always spoke about researching her family history, and I thought this was the best time to go about it. Because my gran's middle name was Aga, we often wondered where the Aga came from. So this was my opportunity to go on the internet and see what I could do. I decided to go into Scotland's People and check out my great-grands. I typed in Mary Jane Aga Hill and typed all that in, and lo and behold, all these names came up. So I was absolutely delighted when I saw my great-grand's name on the computer in front of me. Then I found out that Mary Jane Hill's father was called Alexander Aga, and they were all born in Aberdeen. And Alexander Aga's father was called Salim Aga, who would be my great-great-great-grandfather. I went into Google and put in Salim Aga's name, and lo and behold, in front of me was the life of Salim Aga, and it was a book that he had written to a lady called Elizabeth Thurburn, and that is the first realisation I had, or I knew that Salim was born in the Sudan in Africa.
Award-winning Edinburgh author James McCarthy is a former commander of the King's African Rifles. He's travelled the continent, writing much about the links between Scotland and Africa and the explorers who ventured into its heart.
Salim Aga was born in the Nuba Mountains in a remote part of the Sudan. Salim was captured when he was about 8. He was captured, in fact, by Arab slavers who were common in the area and enslaved many hundreds, if not thousands, of young men like him. And he, in fact, suffered from very ill treatment. In fact, at one point he said the blood came out of his ears, such was the beating that he received. And it was only after he was able to reach the Cairo market that an Englishman from the household of Robert Thurburn, in fact, bought him.
Remarkably, through his extensive research, James McCarthy discovered a direct descendant of the Thurburns living in London.
Well, I'm Andrew Thurburn. I'm great-great-grandson of Robert Thurburn, who was British consul in Alexandria in the middle of the 19th century. At a fairly young age, I think probably about 20, went with his brother John. They went to seek their fortune in Africa and made a lot of money out of the cotton trade and various other things as well. Robert lived in this large house in the middle of Alexandria city called the Sycamores with 6 acres, and he had his Italian butler and a housekeeper, and then when Salim came along that would have been another one for a year or so anyway.
About 1836, he was taken back to Scotland by Robert Thurburn, whose brother John had a large and rather grand house on the banks of the River Dee in Aberdeenshire, and there he was given education not only in the local school, but also he was tutored in the household itself.
The house that Salim would come to live in was designed by architect Archibald Simpson in 1823 and is part of the Myrtle estate, one of the finest in northeast Scotland. This grand estate reflected the wealth and social standing of John Thurburn, with 500 acres of prime shooting ground and salmon fishing on the Dee. John Thurburn lived with his wife Elizabeth and their two children Anna and Barbara. Under Elizabeth's guidance, Salim proved himself a remarkable student and learned quickly. He wrote beautiful poetry, could sing, and learned many practical skills that would prove useful in later life. The colours and textures of Scotland and the comforts of his new surroundings must have made a deep impression on the young Salim. But for an 8-year-old boy far from his family in the Nuba Mountains, life must have been very difficult despite these home comforts.
I absolutely believe that Salim would have missed his family, considering it was only a year, or just under a year, since he'd been taken away from them. He would enjoy privileges that he'd never experienced before. Do you think the life he would have had in the Sudan? There was people getting taken away all the time, and if you think his grandmother was taken away by the other tribes, to me I think this would be his home.
Although it was unusual, Salim's ethnic origins were not unique in this part of Scotland.
About that time, there were a number of black men in particular acting as servants who would be brought back from other parts of the world by British masters.
Salim continued to live at Myrtle, but despite his advanced education and training, the 1841 census shows that he was still classed as a manservant and expected to undertake manual labour.
Salim lived here for 11 years, and I believe it was more in the capacity of a family member rather than a manservant. I believe that he was the son to Elizabeth that she didn't have.
As Salim grew to be a man, he began to attract the attention of the local girls, and one in particular, a lady named Jane Hunter.
We know very little about Jane Hunter, except that she lived in the area and he had a child by her, a man called Alexander.
After becoming a father, it must have been difficult for Salim to contemplate leaving Myrtle. But after so many experiences of travel along the Nile as a young man, the desire for further adventure was strong. At the age of 20, Salim finally decided to leave Myrtle. From his writings, it's apparent that his main motivation was to help bring about the end of the slave trade, still going strong in Africa. He believed that the best way to achieve this was through political lobbying, and he left for London. Salim's gratitude to the Thurburns, in particular Elizabeth, was shown in the dedication he wrote at the beginning of his book.
Madam, having written a short account of some incidents connected with my life, I return my grateful and sincere thanks to you for the great interest you have taken in my education, by which means I have been brought from African darkness to a knowledge of a civilized social life. For these 10 years I have experienced your benevolent care and tuition. Although far distant from kindred and relations, although far from the care of an overlooking mother, I have found in you a truly good substitute for these wants. In whatever circumstances my lot may be cast, I hope your private admonitions will render me impregnable when attacked by the many vices prevalent in the world. I have the honour to be, madam, your most obedient servant, Selim Aga.
After he finished his education and wrote that book at Myrtle, we have no knowledge, or had no knowledge at that time, What I find quite poignant is that my father, who was so keen on family history, writes that in the notes. Of what happened to Salim, we have no knowledge. But of course, he would have been absolutely astonished to discover what he did achieve in his adult later life.
There is a record that he travelled with John Thurburn to various places, although these are not absolutely identified. But what we do know is that in the year 1851, he went to London, the time of the Great Exhibition, and became something of a famous person by lecturing to quite sophisticated audiences about the Nile and about his experiences.
When Marion learned of Andrew Thurburn, she felt compelled to meet him to try and unearth more information about Salim.
My hopes is that maybe he might have some information that I don't have. And after researching Salim for 14 years, I'm hoping there's the wee bit of the icing on the cake for me, whether it be a bit of information I don't have. To hold Salim's book, the narrative that Salim wrote for Elizabeth Thurburn, even just holding the book, I'll be over the moon, absolutely over the moon. This is the first time I've ever been in London, I've ever stepped foot in London. So that for me is exciting times as well. And basically, once more, it's walking in the footsteps of Salim Aga.
I had heard Marion's name, I can remember from James McCarthy's book. When she mentioned who she was and she would like to come down and meet me, I was obviously absolutely delighted, because it would be a coming together of the two families, and a fascinating thing to do given what I and others have subsequently learnt. Well, Marion, here's the book by Salim that you haven't seen before.
Oh, that's amazing. This book's certainly smaller than what I imagined, but that's wonderful. With the author's humble compliment. Incidents connected with the life of Salim Aga, a native of Central Africa. You can't begin to imagine how this feels, me actually holding this book. This trip to London's been absolutely amazing, not only meeting Andrew Thurburn, but to see Salim's autograph in the book, to actually see writing done by his own hand, amazing.
Salim's book about growing up in the Sudan proved very popular. Many copies were printed and sold at anti-slavery rallies. With the profits, Salim would try to help rescue more people from slavery. Marion's grandson, during a family ancestor project at school, discovered that Salim had brought back many items from Africa. In 1860, he sold several of these to museums in Liverpool. Despite her years of research, Marion was unaware of the existence of these objects. Intrigued by this discovery, Marion and her son are on their way to Liverpool to meet Zachary Kingdon from the World Museum. Zachary is curator of African collections. He's garnered a vast wealth of knowledge regarding the continent's history.
Well, Liverpool was the biggest slaving port in the world for a time until the abolition. They pioneered a new way of conducting the slave trade, which was very effective, so they overshadowed ports in France and elsewhere. Selim Aga was involved in a very important early expedition to West Africa, up the Niger River.
Salim accompanied Sir John Hawley Glover aboard the Dayspring expedition, setting sail from Liverpool on the 7th of May 1857. Their objective was to chart the river Niger as far as Busa, facilitating the creation of a commercial outpost that might help undermine the slave trade still thriving in the region. This trip may have prompted Salim to think of other ways to end the trade in human cargo.
Salim was remarkable because he actually put forward a plan for the commercialisation, if you like, of parts of Africa that had no transport facilities.
Salim's grand scheme was the building of a railway across Africa from west to east to forge strong transcontinental trade links that he hoped would hasten the end of the slave trade. Despite much campaigning, his idea never gained any financial backing.
Salim has a very strong connection with the famous explorer Richard Burton. Richard Burton, one must remember, was one of the great explorers, and he needed somebody to be his right-hand man. And they went together in some of the most remote and uninhabited parts of West Africa, some of which were in fact quite difficult, simply because of the attitude of the kings of that time in West Africa. And Richard Burton depended heavily upon Salim to in fact be with him, including actually climbing some of the highest mountains in the Cameroons.
To quote Burton, Selim Aga was an invaluable man who could cook, doctor, carpenter, shoot, and he took all the troubles of life off my hands. Salim brought back various artefacts from his trip up the Niger to Bussa. In 1860, the museum's record book shows the purchase of their first 5 African artefacts from a Mr. Aga. Those items included a large plaited travelling mat, a gourd bowl, a hat, and an embroidered robe.
This was collected in Bida, the capital of Nupe, which had a strong tradition of making these robes. They were robes of honor. They were given out by the emir to favored people in recompense for supporting him. The gown itself was like an amulet, and that was also why an Islamic scholar would have embroidered it to give it that power of an amulet of protection.
Okay. Do you think Salim would have worn this robe?
Yes, I think it's very likely that he would have worn it, and certainly he would have touched it and handled it. Now that you've seen these items and touched them, how does it make you feel?
It makes me feel more connected to Salim Aga. Definitely a closeness.
So how is that different from seeing a letter that he's written or his handwriting? Is it more important, more emotional for
I
you?
think this is more emotionally being able to touch touch this garment that I think he wore, so that was closer to Salim Aga. Writing, yes, even a letter, a signature, whatever, it's part of him, it's part of us, it's part of who we are, and it's part of the family. But this, to actually touch and imagine that he wore this is amazing. I can't really describe in words exactly how I feel about it, but it's wonderful, absolutely wonderful. Salim left these docks in 1857 to go on one of his many expeditions into Africa and brought back these artefacts which still have a strong cultural significance today.
Salim obviously had very fond memories of his time in his youth in Scotland, when he was very well treated and given remarkable opportunities for learning, and not only learning but developing skills. And in fact, during his later life, he said that he would have happily lived in a small cottage in Aberdeenshire, which must have been a complete contrast to his beginnings in the Nuba Mountains.
Salim spent 9 years working in Liberia. He would share much in common with the descendants of African slaves taken there from America. As tensions between the native population and the US immigrants erupted into violent civil war, Salim volunteered as an assistant surgeon, a decision that would prove costly.
Well, the evidence suggests that he was killed during the Grebel Wars, a rebellion in Liberia. He came to a rather grisly end because he was beheaded by the leader of the rebels, despite the fact that he offered to read his Bible to that leader. Salim was probably around about 50 when he died. He led not only a noble but an adventurous life, because he was one of the few people who had travelled on the 3 great rivers of Africa, the Nile, the Niger, and the Congo. The great issue is we don't even have a picture of what he looks like, but we have another picture, and that is the picture of his life through his adventures and through his own writings about particularly his early life.
Before leaving Aberdeen, Marion's research led her to the grave of John and Elizabeth Thurburn in Peter Coulter Parish Church just outside the city. John passed away in 1861 at the age of 80, while Elizabeth continued with her charitable work until her passing in 1872.
My mum would be absolutely delighted to be standing right where I am just now in Peter Coulter Parish Church. This is something that my mother and I always wanted to do, was to retrace our past history of the family. John Thurburn was an important part in our family history, and it's great to be here to make that connection. I mean, if Salim wasn't here, we wouldn't be here basically, so we've got a lot of gratitude towards John Thurburn. Sometimes I wonder if Robert Thurburn had the facilities or could have found Salim's family for him. He took Salim out of slavery, so he felt he was doing good that way. I don't think it maybe would have occurred to him to think about sending him back home because of the journey he'd been on. He was too far away from home. I'm absolutely delighted to have Salim Aga as an ancestor. And for the past 17 years I have been on an amazing journey with him and found out so many pieces of information that have exceeded my expectations. I'm going to continue researching Salim because I know there is more information out there, whether it be a picture, whether it be a letter. There's many avenues I've still to go down. It's just every now and again I hit a brick wall and then all of a sudden information just seems to appear. Can I say that Salim Aga never was a figment of my imagination?